church this evening. About this time last year, I was at the Inner Temple Treasurer's reception, and it was a very good evening, and we were looked after very well, as always, thank you. And I was conscious of being manoeuvred into a corner by two figures in red cassocks. Maybe you know the feeling. And one of them said, "I think it'd be very interesting if you gave a talk in the Temple Church about your time in the army." And I just drew the breath into my lungs to say, well, I don't think people would be very interested in that. At which point the other red cassock said, "Oh, I think that'd be very interesting." And when you're faced with a fait accompli, as maybe you all know, you just sort of accept it. So trying to fit sort of 30 years into 30 minutes is not easy. So I thought what I'd do is I would focus on the operational tours which I have done. And I did 9 operational tours in 30 years in various places, and I'd talk about those. I developed the habit on these tours of carrying a camera in my pocket almost the whole time. And so what I thought I'd do is go through some excerpts from my photograph album and to try and bring to life the things that I was doing. You'll see the quality of some of the photographs changes a bit and you'll see the advent of digital photography as it comes in. And I thought at the start of each of these tours I'd give you a sort of very simple 30-second explanation of what we were doing, with just one exception. I don't intend to talk about my tour in Iraq in 2007. I did a tour in Iraq, not because it was contentious or difficult or anything like that, but because it was actually pretty boring. And we did a tour of duty in Baghdad and then some more time in Basra. But in relative terms, it was all pretty mundane. And so I don't intend to talk about that. And I think this is being recorded, so it means that my colleagues in the Treasury office can debrief me and give me their views tomorrow morning on what they thought, and they'll enjoy that. Okay, slide please. So there it is. That's the story of how the guy on the left there, 22 years old, in his first month at Sandhurst, turned into the person on the right, on his last day of his time in the army. And it's important to say that this is not about me. This is about somebody who joined the army in 1992 and then lived through a quite extraordinary time in the foreign and defense policy period of our country. And if you were to examine the photograph albums of my peer group, you would see much the same thing. So I think that's really a sort of starter for 10. It's not really about me. Slide, please. My first operational tour, I did 2 tours in Northern Ireland in 1994 and 1995. First as a patrol commander, and then secondly as an operations officer, a sort of small-scale planner. In relative terms, it was not particularly dangerous. The first IRA ceasefire was in place. The extremist groups, it's possible to be more extreme than the IRA. The extremist groups who had not declared a ceasefire were badly organized, small in number. And my job was to command a patrol of 12 men. And our job was to patrol constantly in the towns and in the countryside of East Tyrone. And the objective was to patrol so much and so uncertainly, so the terrorists never quite knew where you were going to be, that you could dominate an area, and if you dominate an area yourself, you deny freedom of action to the terrorists. Slide, please. The terrorists, there they are on the left-hand side. I delivered a version of this lecture to my daughter's 6th form at school, and I had to spend quite a lot of time explaining who the IRA were, and there was a terrorist campaign. I feel I probably don't need to go into that level of detail here. Slide, please. And that's me on the left there, in my Army SU flak jacket, about to go out on a patrol, and there on the right-hand side is call sign Oscar 50 Alpha, which was my patrol, 12 of them. Almost all of them older than me, almost all of them more streetwise than me. All of them had done at least one tour of Northern Ireland before me, and yet I was in charge. And I learned very quickly the art of taking advice, forming a group and a team, but at the same time having an absolutely hard line that I was in charge and there were some things on which I wouldn't compromise. And my things were rifles and ammunition and vehicles, the way we used vehicles, because those two things seemed to me to be the things where we could cause more damage to ourselves accidentally than we'd ever caused to terrorists. But it was a very enjoyable time, and I learned an awful lot about low-level leadership. Slide, please. Roll forward 5 years, and in 1999, I'm 29 years old, and I'm the adjutant to my battalion based in Germany. And we're based in Germany in what are called warrior armored fighting vehicles, which are, to all intents and purposes, small tanks which you can get 8 people in the back of, with a lot of guns on them. And the year of 1999 was looking very routine and very peaceful and very calm, and not much was going to happen. And of course, in the army, when that kind of thing happens, something jumps up and hits you straight between the eyes. Slide, please. And for us, it was Kosovo, because Kosovo, Albania to the southwest, Serbia around its northern border, Macedonia down to its southeast, and a small border with Montenegro. Throughout 1998 and 1999, the Serb army moved into and occupied large parts of Kosovo. And they then expelled large amounts of the native Albanian population down into Macedonia and to Albania. And the Albanians fled. Because in large part they were absolutely petrified, rightly, that if they didn't, then the Serbs would summarily murder them. NATO got involved, and NATO flew into Macedonia, a presence of tens of thousands of NATO soldiers along this border here, and broadly in the area between Kuminova and Skopje. There was a huge build-up of NATO forces, and a few in Albania as well. Slide, please. The Albanian refugees fled Kosovo and lived in refugee camps, and we visited often to hear at first hand what had caused the adults, what had caused the Albanian population to leave Kosovo. And they came with their families, young and old, to sort of makeshift camps like this. On the right, it's quite amusing to think now those young boys are probably well into their 30s with families of their own, all Albanians. I just remember when that photograph was taken, that monkey on the left spent a good amount of time trying to get my pistol out of my holster. And I have to say unsuccessfully, which was great. It was impossible to ignore the sense of hopelessness in a refugee community. It's really interesting to reflect. If you've never seen it and breathed it as you have there, it's very hard to sort of take that on board. Because when you are deprived of your home in all its manifestations, you have very little to rely on. So as the spring of 1999 ramped up, so the air campaign ramped up. Slide, please. And the accuracy of some of the NATO bombing has been the subject of some quite sort of hostile commentary. And it is true to say that hitting the Chinese embassy in Belgrade was not a good piece of NATO targeting. But tactically, in Kosovo, there was some really, really excellent targeting, which sought to have an effect without taking human life. And I took this photograph from a helicopter in the summer once we got into Kosovo. That was a Serb army warehouse with equipment, tanks, weaponry, and all kinds of hardware. That was the Serb army barracks where the people lived, and that was an Albanian farmhouse. And the targeteers had worked out, as it turned out quite correctly, that we can have an effect by destroying all their kit, make their eardrums hurt but don't kill them, and leave the civilian population alone. And it was an excellent example of some really excellent targeting actually in Kosovo. Slide, please. The force builds up, and on the morning of the 11th of June 1999, NATO entered Kosovo in force. And remember the threat of force, and there was a very substantial threat of force backed up by the air campaign, forced Milosevic into a change of heart to allow NATO in. I took that photograph just after dawn in the assembly area, and you can see there that's artillery pieces, Apache helicopters, an armoured fighting vehicle, tanks, and all sorts of hardware. And the Serbs got the message and did not, thankfully, oppose our move into Kosovo. Dawn the following day, Dawn the following day sees us in Pristina, that's the capital of Kosovo, and these Serb soldiers sitting on the steps of the Serb army headquarters in Kosovo, skulking away there. And we went over to them and told them, you're here illegally, you should have moved out. If we come back in 2 hours' time and you're still here, we're going to detain a lot of you. And what you can't see in that photograph is behind me, there are a whole load of tanks. And funny old thing, 2 hours later, there was not a sign of them, they'd all gone. That afternoon, we spread out and started walking down the side streets and around the streets of Pristina, and it became clear then some of the really difficult, dark parts of the Serb occupation of Kosovo. And I walked down an alleyway, and an old man came up to me. He was an Albanian, and he said, come into my back garden. And I went into his back garden, and he said, when the Serbs arrived here, they put 6 members of my family, this is about 2 months previously, put 6 members of my family up against a wall, and they shot the lot of them. And then he took some corrugated iron off the pit in his garden, and the 6 members of his family were still in the pit. And that was just the first of a sort of really sort of difficult scenes that we saw and uncovered. That taught me, though, that the threat of force can be as powerful as force itself when used wisely, and the threat of force itself can prevent much bloodshed and heartache. Slide, please. You remember I said at the start of 1999, it looked as if my year ahead was pretty boring, there wasn't much going on, so I volunteered in, I think, January or February, for service on secondment to the United Nations on one of their peacekeeping missions. And I sort of sent the letter off and forgot about it. And then Kosovo happened. And a week before we left Kosovo, I got a letter saying, you've been accepted for service as a United Nations military observer in Sierra Leone starting in January. And I left Kosovo in October. So I went home to England. I had Christmas in England. And then, slide please, January 2000 saw me in Sierra Leone. For those not familiar with the geography, and that was me before I went there, slide please, Sierra Leone is a small former British colony on the west coast of Africa, bracketed broadly by Guinea and Liberia. And for years, a civil war raged there between, on the one hand, the government forces and their allied militia, and on the other, a really brutal rebel force called the Revolutionary United Front, or the RUF. And it was all about diamonds, money, and power, or the perception of power. Slide, please. So the UN put in a military force to monitor the ceasefire, to destroy the surrendered munitions, which the rebels surrendered when they came in as part of the ceasefire. And when the ceasefire broke down, we would advise the Sierra Leone armed forces about what they were doing and about the sort of the force-on-force conflict they were having with the rebels. And they did this by sending small teams to live all over the country. I went to Port Loko. It says Port Lake there, but actually it's Port Loko. 70 miles northwest of Freetown, surrounded in large part by the rebels, no running water, no electricity, and a very fragile garrison of Nigerian army troops. Slide, please. And that's the main street in Port Loko town, and it was an education in how to live devoid of any comforts of Western life. And you also find out very quickly that children in Sierra Leone are just as fond as children in Albania of a photograph. Slide, please. All the time, the threat from the rebels was very significant, and they were a feared force. Why? Because their trademark was to move into an area and then, as they would say, traumatically amputate, by which I mean I get a machete and then cut off the limbs of children, either at the wrist or at the elbow. If you are squeamish or you might want to watch the children down there, of a nervous disposition, look away now. Slide, please. Because on patrol, it was quite common to come across people like that. That is 10-year-old Issa Sese, and for a laugh, the rebels have held his arm in a fire until it melted the wrist joint, and then for a laugh, they just took a machete and took a swipe straight across his chest. That one had a happy ending because he was picked up by Caritas and taken to America to be operated on with his family. So that one ended up happily. Slide, please. I took these, so the fight to the rebels was mainly prosecuted by these guys. Those are the soldiers of the Sierra Leone army. and on the right, their allied militia group, the Kamajors. And this gentleman here is wearing these cloth patches on his uniform because they make him bulletproof, and bullets go around him in his folklore. And so you're advising the Sierra Leone army, and these gentlemen here would not think of fighting without having a lot of marijuana to smoke, a couple of strong glasses of palm wine, and off they go, which makes it a somewhat volatile environment when you're dealing with live weapons, live ammunition, and rifles. During the ceasefire, the rebels were mandated to hand in their weaponry, and they put it in containers like this. And at the back, you can see sort of rifles and rocket launchers, all pretty benign, no problem there. These are Chinese hand grenades, slightly less benign. These are unexploded ordnance dropped by the government Alpha Jet onto rebel positions. And the rebels, thinking that they would get money for it, pick it up, come and put it on your table and say, I want my money. And you go, okay, well, we need to be a little bit calm about that. And the only thing to do with this stuff, really, is to dig a pit, put some plastic explosive in it, and then blow the whole lot up. Because the alternative is that one fine day, some child's going to pick it up, and it's going to go boom in their face. My reflection on that was that there were 18 nations in the military force in Sierra Leone. Some had direct interest in the country, some none whatsoever. But I reflected that whoever said, for evil to flourish, good people have to do nothing, really had a point. And in Sierra Leone, a lot of good people did something. And by the time, sort of about a couple of years after I left, the RUF were dead and gone, and Sierra Leone was picking itself up as a sort of civilized country. Slide, please. In 2010 and 11, fast forward sort of 10 years or so, I commanded my regiment, the Irish Guards, in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, in the winter of 2010 and 11. Slide, please. The UK presence in Afghanistan, which lasted 20-odd years, is well documented. Afghanistan, landlocked country, Iran, Turkmenistan, Pakistan. And after the 9/11 attacks, NATO put a force into Kabul in 2001, 2002. By 2005 and 6, that force was expanding into the other provinces in Afghanistan, and Britain took on Helmand Province. One of the most reliant upon opium, one of the most violent, and it led to some of the most intense conflict for British forces since the Korean War some 50 years before. There were some 10,000 British troops in Helmand at any one time. Only about 4,000 of them, interestingly, were actually out on the ground at any one time. The remainder were in logistic, enabler, medical, and aviation roles. But the 4,000 were up and down the Helmand River Valley here, and amongst the population. And the idea was you live in huts, you live in compounds, and the more you can dominate a particular area, the harder it is for the insurgents to operate. The more you can protect aid, the more you can protect the government of Afghanistan, the more you can protect the Afghan army, the easier it is for them to influence the population rather than the Taliban. One of the battalions, one of the regiments in each rotation, instead of doing their own thing and sort of dominating an area, will be told to partner with the Afghan army rather than to have a sort of area of operations of their own. And on my rotation, that was us. And so the Afghan army were based broadly from Lashkar here all the way up the Helmand River Valley, through Gereshk, up past Shirakian and up to Sangin, and then west to just sort of to about the area of Tal Kalar. And there were 22 Afghan army bases, and my regiment was split up all amongst them, advising them, mentoring, guiding them, and planning operations with them. And we planned and conducted big operations to find, destroy, and clear the Taliban out of particular areas so they could not gain the initiatives. That meant an awful lot of time out on patrol, and that's how a self-respecting British soldier goes around Helmand Province, Afghanistan, in the winter of 2010. And that's me in front of the Helmand River, in front of one of the dams that the Russians had built when they spent a prolonged period in the country. Slide, please. I partnered the Afghans, and so that guy on the left is called General Shirin Shah. He is the commander of the Afghan army in Helmand, and he has come properly from the school of hard knocks. He survived the tail end of the Russian occupation. He fought through with the Mujahideen, and now he was in the Afghan army. That was his completely ineffective second-in-command, who's called Colonel Mohammed, whose sole and only preoccupation was going on leave. And Sher Shah, completely the opposite, who never went on leave, and all he wanted to do was fight the Taliban. That was us on one of the trips we took. That was in Sangin, and Sangin at the time was one of the most dangerous places on the planet for a British soldier. Martin's regiment, the year before I was there, had a very, very difficult, very costly, and extremely violent tour in Sangin. And we went up there to have a chat to the governor, that's him there, about the situation there. And we're standing there on the roof of the government centre, the district centre in Sangin. Slide, please. I mentioned that to support the Afghans, we launched a series of really huge, big operations involving hundreds of British and Afghan soldiers. And this was taken on one of those operations, and you can see the sort of mud-walled compounds in which people lived. That's me sitting on an ammunition box, talking to my subordinate commanders, giving them instructions, orders about an operation we were going to conduct the following day. It taught me, if I needed teaching it, the value of young British soldiers. And there have been lots in the press about the PlayStation generation. Young people are no good. They're not like their fathers and grandfathers, you know. And it taught me what a load of rubbish that was, and how good young British soldiers were. And almost the worse it got, the better they got. But if all this looks like Boy's Own, I would point out to you that of the 728 soldiers I took to Afghanistan, 6 were killed in action, 23 had life-changing injuries, and that's something that lives with me on a daily basis, that I was responsible for those deaths and those people who were wounded. Slide, please. Roll forward sort of 3-4 years, and I returned from Afghanistan in 2011, and after 3 years in the UK, I then went on exchange to the American Army between 2014 and 15. And then I did 2 jobs in Iraq, each lasting about a year, which were broadly similar. And this was all about the mission against ISIS. In 2014, this gentleman here, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, stood on the balcony of the Al-Nuri Mosque in Mosul in northern Iraq, and he declared a caliphate, declared the second caliphate, and sort of gave the call to arms to lots of young Sunni extremists, of whom a lot of whom we'd come to know as Al-Qaeda. And that's what they look like. And for savagery and inhumanity, they take first prize. They leave the RUF in the shade for the things that they do to other people. Slide, please. They were they started their uprising really in sort of northeast Syria. They came into Iraq through Tal Afar. They hit Mosul. They turned right and came down the seam of the country through Beji, through to Crete, and stopped around Samarra. And at the same time, they came in through western Iraq, through Ramadi and Fallujah, and they form a sort of encirclement to the north and west of Baghdad, about 20 miles from the capital. Cue panic from the Iraqi government, the diplomatic community, the aid workers, everyone who's in Iraq. They all try and leave. My role was, and that's when the American headquarters came in, and so it's rather sort of funny, strangely satisfying if you're a soldier to be coming into a country when everyone else is trying to get out. I had a role which was fourfold. The first was to do some targeting of ISIS, in terms of targeting them from the air. The second was fighting ISIS in the information space. And one of the things that the coalition of 34 nations who were there forming the military coalition were terrified about was homegrown terrorism which would be inspired by ISIS, or ISIS successfully propagating their message in the capitals of Western nations. And so my job with a team was to combat them and counter them in the information space. And that meant holding press conferences like that, putting material on the internet which was rooted in Islam and the Muslim faith, which countered their version of it, and then stopping them propagating their message by, for example, preventing them distributing and printing and distributing their sort of in-house magazine, which is called Dabiq. And Dabiq is to ISIS as counsel is to the bar. And it was very, very successfully propagated and thrown around in our first year. By the time we came back, we were able to force them off printed copy because we found out where they were printing it. We targeted the printing workshop, and that was the end of that. And we forced them into a very poor online copy. The third thing I did was to bind together and brief and hold the coalition. And that meant getting to know the heads of the army, the defense secretaries, and sometimes the head of states of all the coalition nations. And that's me briefing the head of the Spanish army, who came out with the King of Spain to visit the very sizable Spanish contingent who were in Iraq and did an absolutely outstanding job. And then the last bit of that, when I had a bit of spare time, was to help train and coalesce the training of the Iraqi army to combat ISIS in Iraq. The concept being that no matter how much foreign support you have, eventually this nation and this nation's army have got to hold it themselves. Slide, please. The scale of the destruction that ISIS wrought was quite extraordinary. That is what is left of the Al-Nuri Mosque in Mosul. That's the balcony from where Baghdadi proclaimed the caliphate. Again, as ISIS left Mosul, destroyed. That's me in the ruins of West Mosul. And then I took this one standing on top of the hospital. Iraq was a very developed and cultured country in many ways, and medicine was one of those ways. They had a really excellent medical service. I'm standing on the roof of the hospital. That's the doctors and nurses accommodation block, and this is the maternity hospital. ISIS turn up. They don't like culture. They don't like anything that's Western. They certainly don't like a maternity hospital because it's got something to do with women. It doesn't subscribe to their level, to their sort of outlook, their version of Islam, and so they destroyed the lot. Slide, please. And that's what it looked like at ground level. This taught me that ISIS, flowing from Al-Qaeda and everything that had come before, was that you can physically destroy an enemy. To destroy an ideology is infinitely harder, if not impossible. And I came away from these tours absolutely convinced of the difficulty of destroying an ideology. Incredibly difficult. Slide, please. I finished that in 2019 and came home, slide please, as Robin said, to be General Officer commanding London District and Major General commanding the Household Division. My responsibility was to command the army in London, and so we delivered all the military support to the NHS during the COVID pandemic in London. And along with that, I also held responsibility for big state ceremonial events. The routine stuff which happens every year, Trooping the Colour, state opening of Parliament, state visits, all very routine, not particularly difficult. I also held responsibility for all the royal funerals. There are 24 on the books at any one time. They're all named after a bridge. We delivered Prince Philip's funeral in 2021. But the one that everybody focused on was Operation London Bridge, the funeral of the Queen. When you start this job, you're taken off into a room, a bit like, I suppose, the Prime Minister sort of getting the nuclear brief on day one. And you're briefed in great detail about the plans. And I got the briefing. Okay, it's fine. You know. And I said to the group of staff around me, I said, is this going to happen to us? And somebody with such conviction and authority said, absolutely not, sir. No, this will be for our successors. You know, we'll do Prince Philip, but this is for our successors. It won't happen to us. I thought, inwardly, I'm afraid. I thought, okay, what's for that? You know, that's a fucking good thing. But the plans were written in huge detail. And every time I went on holiday, I carried with me a small little plastic folder so that if necessary and I was away on holiday, I could have a conference call to get me through the first 24 hours before I could get back to London. Both I and my key staff never went on holiday outside Europe because the idea of being in the Far East when this happened was out of the question. I think we can all remember where we were, sort of around lunchtime on the 8th of September, when I got a call about 11 o'clock in the morning by someone who said, things aren't looking great at Balmoral. And I said, is this it? And he went, I think it might be. This is the page in my notebook from lunchtime on the 8th of September. So I put London Bridge, 8th of September. And then here's the sort of list of things which, just from my knowledge of the plan, I had to do immediately. Ensure the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery has got enough people. They were on leave. They have to deliver a gun salute at midday, the day after death. And I knew half of them were on leave and half of them were looking after their horses in Woolwich. One of the great strokes of good fortune was the 8th of September was changeover day, when they all happened by pure chance to be there. The Queen's Company of the Grenadier Guards, whose job it is to carry the coffin and escort the coffin, were in Kurdistan in northern Iraq. The number of horses I knew we would need. The state trumpeters, the household cavalry, who announce all the big events, were in Calgary. And so I was in this strange position for that second half of that day where if I was seen to start the ball rolling and seen to start doing things, people would notice it would be in incredibly bad taste, because the Queen could have lived for days. And yet I had to be as ready as I could. So I divided things up into on death and now. And that's that was my initial punt. Slide, please. That photograph was taken in the late afternoon in Horse Guards building with my key staff. Funny enough, I'm in a blue uniform because I've been on my way to an event in Windsor. Everyone else had sort of dropped whatever they were doing and come in. We were just sort of trying to work out, how we were going to get through the first few days. You'll see we've all got these coloured sheets in front of us. That's because the plan was summarised. Every event, every rehearsal, the whole 10 days between the Queen's death and her committal were summarised on these sheets of paper. And so you can see we've literally dropped what we're doing and we've come in to sort of look through this. Between the death of the sovereign and the committal, there are 8 events. Proclamation, the day after death. The gun salute in Hyde Park, the day after death. The Queen's move back to London from wherever she has died. The procession from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Hall. The lying in state. The procession from Westminster Hall to Westminster Abbey. The funeral and procession to Hyde Park Corner. And then the procession in Windsor and the committal. 8 events. For every event, there's a briefing to the people involved. There's a recce to go and walk the ground so they know where they're going. There's a rehearsal, and then you execute it. You don't need a further maths degree to work out that that's 8 events, 4 events for each one, and you suddenly find you're very busy. Happily, however, there are 24 hours in every day, and there are 7 days in every week. And for those 10 days, I don't think we slept more than 2 or 3 hours a time, and we were always thinking about the next thing, and you're thinking 2 events ahead while you're executing one of the 8 behind you, and you're in this strange sort of twilight zone. I tried to keep a diary, and I did keep a diary. At about D+6, I got hopelessly confused. I wrote it at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I couldn't work out whether it was D+5 or D+6, and it was all rather peculiar. Slide, please. That's a sort of quick hats off to the Royal Air Force. Of course, one of the things we didn't know where the Queen would die. And so we had a plan for death in Windsor, which was royal train back to London. We had a plan for death at Sandringham, which was train back to London. We had a plan for death in Scotland, which is either train or aircraft back to London. And we had a plan for death in London, which would have been the simplest. And then we had a plan for death in another place. They all arrived back in London on the afternoon of D+4 with the Queen's arrival. In the end, she died in Scotland, and there were all kinds. I mean, that was great for us because it gave us 4 days when she was still in Scotland. What it did to the union between England and Scotland, I leave to you. That's the D+5 procession from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Hall, going through the office. Next slide, please. And that's the lying in state. 300,000 people went through Westminster Hall in 4 days. The watches changed every 20 minutes in those 4 days, and so we had to do a sort of duty roster for 4 days, groups of 4, changing every 20 minutes. And we did it by bringing people in, bringing the new watches in this way, because we worked out that if they'd come in from the staircases here, we'd have had to stop the line of people. And if you do that every 20 minutes, over 4 days, you get 60,000 people less through the hall. So we designed it so we never had to stop the flow. I did 2 watches around the coffin, very, very emotive stuff. That's the procession on D+10 from the Abbey. The funeral has just taken place. The funeral, incidentally, very unusual. The preceding monarchs had all had their funerals in St. George's Chapel in Windsor. This is the first one where the funeral took place in Westminster Abbey and then a move to Windsor. And despite all the planning, there were small details here and there which we had to look up. And so as we were shuttling to and from Windsor on the M4, I found myself on my phone watching the sort of Pathé footage of 1952 and 1937, desperately trying to enlarge the screen to catch some small point of detail to make sure that we got the custom and the precedent right. Slide, please. That's going up the Mall, which I think was quite a splendid sight. Slide, please. Spare a thought for these 8 young men from the Queen's Company of the Grenadier Guards. Do you remember them from my notebook? 10 days before this, they were on an operational tour in northern Iraq, patrolling in the mountains of Kurdistan. 10 days later, they were here, and they did an absolutely awesome job, I think. Slide, please. And that was the final procession. It was to have been through the streets of Windsor, but we changed the plan because of COVID, because it was thought that the streets of Windsor, we'd have too many people congregating too close together. I'm not sure we achieved the effect here. Absolutely extraordinary, coming up the long walk at Windsor. And actually, we didn't get this quite right, that was a bit too narrow, so we're all a bit squeezed in, as you can see there. Sort of one for next time, but you compromise. Slide, please. It is a certainty in a constitutional monarchy that coronation follows funeral, and so about a month after the funeral, we started getting the first sort of instructions about the coronation. It was easier doing the coronation because we had far longer to plan. We had more time, and that was great. The flip side was more time is more time for people with good ideas to come and tell you about them. You go, thank you. The other flip side is there was far less squeamishness on the part of protesters. And so while I think there was one protester with a "Not My King" sign at the funeral, there were a whole load of them for the coronation. And we got a sort of bit of intelligence that they were going to buy en masse rape alarms and then pull the rape alarms and throw them as they were sounding into the middle of the household cavalry divisions, which would send the horses sort of hither and thither. And so the operation was far more complex because there was more time to come at it. Slide, please. Anyway, it went well, I think. Funnily enough, it rained on the day, as it had rained on the day of the Queen's coronation, as it had rained on the day of George VI's coronation. Who would have guessed? But the wet weather plan was that we just got wet. And I had a very, very amusing conversation with quite a senior member of the royal family who said, and she said to me, I said, "How did you get on, ma'am?" She said it was fine, but I was the first into the coach, and she was in I think the Irish State Coach, which would have been sort of down here. And she said, "What you don't know about the Irish State Coach, Chris, is that it's got a roof like that. So if you're the first person to get into it, you get the straps and you pull yourself in, and of course the whole thing goes shh." And I went, "Oh no." And she said, "Yep, I took one for the team that day." I won't tell you who she was, but she, on the balcony afterwards, you simply wouldn't have guessed. And that's where it ended, in the garden of Buckingham Palace. That's every single member of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Commonwealth contingents lined up to give 3 cheers for the King, which I think was a nice way to finish the day. Slide, please. A quick shout out, as I said, it's not about me, a quick shout out for him, for Atticus, who carried me from sort of November 2019 to June 2023, including on the coronation. Extremely lazy, that's good, but extremely nervous, and so he would shy very violently at loud noises. And so as you can imagine, this is coronation day. I'm not feeling at all comfortable with this crowd screaming on either side of us as we closed down the Mall. Very nerve-wracking. Slide, please. And that's where it took me to. So I thought I'd end up there. But that's, as I say, a canter through 30 years in 30 minutes of... Somebody asked me the other day whether I would change any of it, and the answer emphatically is no. I was exceptionally fortunate to live through these times, but so were all of us, because, of course, the people to the left and the right of you are really the reason you do it. And I was very privileged to serve with some outstanding people. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions. If people have them, I'd be delighted, yes.
Hello, thank you very much. So which is easier, being in charge of a load of troops in the Coronation or looking after disparate barristers in chambers? and what did you learn from the first that helped you deal with the second?
Obviously, barristers are far more organised and disciplined and far harder to organise than people in the military, clearly, because they're people of greatness. I think I learned that belief in your underlying cause and the ethos and the reason you do things is the why is probably the most important thing. You do all these things, but it's the why that is the unifying purpose between them all. I think that's probably as true for barristers as it is for soldiers. Fantastic. That's great.
Do you want? Take that. There you go.
Question was, you joined the regiment you did. Were you able to ride a horse before?
No, I didn't learn as a child or anything like it. But I did. I did 2 jobs preceding this where I had to ride a horse. So when I was the commanding officer, I got back from Afghanistan, and so 2 months later I was on Trooping the Colour on a horse, and so I had to learn. But you get rusty very quickly, so I had to become as proficient as I could quite quickly. So I used to ride sort of 3 or 4 mornings a week in Hyde Park to get good enough. And I wouldn't say I was any better than just good enough. So yeah, I rather enjoyed it actually, it was fun.
Thank you so much for an interesting talk. In all the very different experiences you were showing to us, what was the quality that you think you most needed to get you through all of them?
That's a good question. I think resilience of body and mind, and what John F. Kennedy was said to possess, grace under pressure. Because there's pressure in all of that, and you have to exude, and even if you're not feeling it inside, you have to exude an aura of calm and confidence. And I think if you have that and you can remain clear in mind, even in very difficult and challenging circumstances, fatigue, danger, combination of both, then I think you will get to where you want to be. I would say though, all that is for nothing without good people around you, and whether it's the other 11 men in Oscar 50 Alpha, or it's 8,500 people around you on the Coronation, without them, you are an irrelevance. If that's not too much of a cheat, to give you 2 answers to that.
Is there one last question? I think you might take anything about something, does he? Then we can thank Christopher properly. Has anyone got one final question?
Fantastic. Hello, Janice. Despite Matt's
With this week's events across the pond, do you now fear for the future?
Well, Janice. Thanks, Janice. I think, interesting, when I was in Iraq, Trump was president first term, we had a substantial presence in Syria. And he rolled out of bed one morning and said, take all American forces out of Syria. Now. And we sort of said, has he talked to us about this? No, he hadn't talked to anybody about it. And that was difficult for a whole series of military reasons. I think things are less certain, politics aside, uncertain. And I think one learns to be careful, to be cautious about uncertainty. You learn to live with it, but you have to be cautious about it. Because financial markets and countries and armies and the world generally, certainty is good. So I think uncertainty is not a good thing. I'm trying really hard to skate between anything contentious at that point.
Christopher, it's been a really unforgettable evening. You have made this so special for all of us. I mean, it's both very informative, of course. It's also extremely moving and uplifting and frankly rather inspiring. And I'm glad that I need to know grace under pressure among the barristers is what we really need. Thank you from all of us and all of those who are watching it and then will watch it over the coming couple of days. We are enormously grateful to you for doing this. Those of you who can stay for a last drink, you're welcome to do so before you go home. And can I just ask that we all thank Christopher very, very much indeed.